Okay, we are live on air with Dan Rothstein and Dan. One change. And I'm excited to have Dan with us today. Go ahead, Dan.
Great.
Can you hear us?
We were having a little problem. Some of that got cut off, but I heard that it's my turn.
Are you still there, Dan?
Yeah, I'm here. So we ready to go?
Oh. Yeah, we are ready.
Okay. All right. Okay. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's very exciting to be here. Thank you, Chris, for making this happen. Jay Dodd here in working with me is kind of providing tech support here and helping us. So we're really excited to be with you. What I'd like to do is just check in with you on a couple things before we move ahead. How many of you are already familiar with the question formulation technique?
One kind of.
Okay, very good. All right. So what the best use of this time? Why don't I just give you a quick overview of what it is, what happens when students use it, some examples of how it's used, and then we can open up to discussion about implications for your teaching in your classroom. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Good, good. Heads nodding is very good, very helpful for me. Okay.
Thumbs up, you guys. Thumbs up. There we go.
There we go. Okay, great, great. Nodding versus nodding off. That's always good. So, okay. There's a little bit of a delay in going back and forth, so I'll be trying to I'm just going to talk a little bit now, and if you want to interrupt me or there's something that's not coming through, just signal me and I'll stop.
Also, make sure to ask questions.
Right. So Jay's saying also that you're welcome to ask questions in the chat on the side. So, okay. All right. So the question formulation technique developed out of work that my co-author, co-director Luz Santana and I did, working outside the classroom, outside of education, working primarily in low-income communities around the country, and developing a strategy for teaching people how to advocate for themselves. The idea originally about teaching the skill of question formulation came from parents in one low-income community who were not participating in their children's education and were naming a problem that was keeping them from participating. They talked about not knowing what to ask. And we were very smart. It only took us 1,000 or 2,000 times of hearing that. And we realized that, well, they really have named an important problem. And it turns out that they had named a problem that really had never gotten much attention on how significant an obstacle it is to action, to participation, and to effective thinking, the ability not knowing how to ask your own questions. So we got to work on that. We worked on it for many years, developed lengthy curricula, tried out teaching in many different environments. A strategy, for example, was used in healthcare. The National Institutes of Health did a randomized controlled trial studying how our strategy was being taught to patients who learned how to ask their own questions and showed jaw-dropping results in terms of increases in patient activation and engagement, and there are articles about it in the medical literature. So along came some teachers, and they said, well, you know, this is relevant to what we're doing, what we're trying to do in our classrooms. I ask my students, do you have any questions? And I don't really get much from them. I try to encourage them to ask questions. I get questions maybe from a couple kids or from a few, but I don't really get all of them thinking and asking questions. So they took what we had developed as the question formulation technique and began to use it in their classroom. So thanks to them, they were really pioneers. They demonstrated that if you use a simple process, you can actually not only get students asking more questions, they wind up asking better questions. and they could see the changes in the classroom dynamics. So what I want to do is I just want to give a quick overview of what it is that they took into the classroom and then how it's used. So what it is a simple process that allows students to do three things: to produce their own questions, to improve their questions, and to strategize on how to use their questions. So in that, what you're actually seeing is several steps for doing that. And it's very interesting because the steps start off with the teacher designing a question focus, which is different from a traditional prompt. Very often a prompt you might use in a class might be a question that might come from you to the students to try to stimulate thinking. And there's been a lot of work done on working with teachers around questions that could be asked of students. So the difference here is it's called the question focus because it's a focus for student questions. And so the teacher would design a question focus in line with what they're going to be teaching, the theme of their work, where they want to be going, what they want the students to be able to do. And then the students would produce questions. They'd use rules for producing questions. And it's very interesting. The rules are basically just 4 rules. The first one is ask as many questions as you can. And of course, in many ways, what we'd like is for there not to be a need for any more rules. Just ask as many questions as you can. But as you know, and as many people experience, is that that's not sufficient. Just inviting questions. So the other rules come along to actually create a safe environment and opportunity for students to ask the questions. They produce their questions then. Generally, the first time they go through it, they're working in small groups. And then as they produce their questions, they move to a next step and they look at open and close-ended questions. And as they're looking at open and close-ended questions, many times students discover that the way you ask a question determines the kind of information you get. This is no small discovery. And they're not being told this, they're discovering this as they're going through it. And they're also not being judged about their questions are not being judged. They're really you're trying to create space for them to be working with their own questions, figuring out how to ask them in different ways. And then they do something where they might practice changing from a closed-ended question to an open-ended question. And then they go through, and at different steps in this process, they're also being asked to think about their thinking. So when they're presented with the rules for producing questions, they're asked to think about what might be difficult about following the rules. So they think about how it is different from the way they usually work, how they usually ask one question, then start to discuss it or answer it. But instead, one of the rules says, do not stop to judge, discuss, or answer any of the questions. So they become conscious of their own thinking. They look at open and closed. They look at advantages and disadvantages of open and closed. And then they move to prioritizing their questions. And as they prioritize their questions, they really begin to discover that in their long list of questions, that they may discover that they needed to answer question number 9 before they can answer question number 2. And they look at and they choose their priority questions, and they see that very often their priority questions come from different places in their list of questions. So there's a lot of learning going on as they're doing that. They're asked to reflect on what they learned, to name what they learned by asking questions, to think about how they learned it. At that point, they've gone through a process where they actually have used 3 different thinking abilities. They've used divergent thinking. They're divergent thinking when they're producing questions. They're doing convergent thinking, where they're narrowing down, focusing, sharpening their thinking as they go through looking at the closed and open-ended questions and prioritization. And they're also engaged in metacognition, because they're thinking about their thinking, they're thinking about how they learned, about how they generally operate. So you have those three thinking abilities that are activated. It's very exciting. The energy that you see in the classroom, teachers just consistently report that they're astounded by just how engaged and how energetic the students are as they go through the process. And then there are 3 observable outcomes that are consistently reported. The first one, as I referred to, is the students are more engaged. They're actively learning, participating. They also take more ownership of their learning. And they are learning more deeply. They're discovering, they're basically unpacking, unraveling a complexity of a problem. So we just had a conversation with a high school math teacher the other day who teaches everything from algebra 2 through pre-calc, trig, and calculus. And he talked about how he uses the strategy in his classroom, and now they basically say to him, okay, we don't need you, we understand, we know how this works, and they go through the process, and by asking questions and going through this process, which is a fairly rigorous process, it's a structured process, by going through it, they are able to unravel the problem, figure things out, and they get to probably the most important discovery that you might want a student to get to, which is that when you've learned something, that's not the end, that's the basis for a new question and a new point of exploration. So that's one of the most exciting things that happen when students go through this process. And in our book, Make Just One Change, we actually talk about a math teacher who wound up teaching his own little unit and course on thinking like a mathematician, and had them look at how, when they solved problems, how to move from that to then identifying what their next question is. There's also a book that I would recommend. Obviously, I recommend our book for certain reasons. Our book, which is really about how do you use the process and allows you to go in depth into it. But there's another book that it's science teachers. It's kind of geared towards science teaching, but it really has universal relevance across all fields. And it's called Ignorance: How It Drives Science. And the author is Stuart Firestein, F-I-R-E-S-T-E-I-N. And he talks about basically that when you look at textbooks, and he talks about a 1,400-page textbook that he uses in his class. He says that it actually gives students the mistaken impression that everything that there is to know is in that textbook. And he's trying to make the argument is that the textbook is the beginning point for trying to figure out all that we don't know. So it's a different way of thinking. It's a way in which students are really looking at learning as a process that they're engaged in, that they can direct, that they can take some ownership on, and that their questions are questions that can drive their learning. So an example of, we had somebody who participated in our summer seminar a couple of summers ago, who's the Associate Provost for Innovation and Education at Brandeis University here in Massachusetts. And he took the question formulation technique, and he took the title of the textbook in his biology course, and he just presented the title of the textbook as the question focus. And he had the students ask questions about it as they were going through. Just ask questions about the title of it. They went through the whole QFT, and then they began to see as they went through the course of the semester that they were answering questions that they had asked that first day in class. Then the last day of the course, he presented the same question focus, the title of the textbook, and he had them go through the question formulation technique again, and then they looked at how different their questions were after they had gone through the class. So there's a great growth and awareness of themselves as learners and as thinkers. And this is used across all areas, all subject areas, all levels, and that's the essence right there. So I'd like to open it up for you all to ask questions and share thoughts, ideas, tell me what you'd like to know more about.
What, I don't know if you hear me, but what drive, there's that initial just moment where nobody wants to say anything or kids don't want to drive questions. Is it that they're sitting at their desk and generating them without that public fear, and so that's what kind of helps get them past that initial stumbling block?
So that is really related to the questions, the rules for producing questions. It's creating a safe environment. So the 4 rules simply are: ask as many questions as you can, do not stop to judge, discuss, or answer any questions, write down every question exactly as it's stated, and change statements into questions. Now, those are 4 rules. It took us about 8 years to come up with those 4 rules. Now, it's not because we were working at the glacial speed of a half a rule a year, but it was really about how do we throw out everything else and what's the minimum that could be used to create a safe space and a structure for students to ask questions. So teachers have seen that this works in different ways. Having them work in small groups on their own, they begin that process. The role of the teacher is simply as a facilitator from the side, who's basically reminding them to follow the rules. That creates some space for them to do that. Some students, some groups get at it more slowly than others, but it's about giving them some time to do that. Some teachers have students work on their questions on their own and then come together. There are different ways to do it, but what you named, David, is really this challenge which is, well, if we invite questions, what's going to break the silence? How are we going to get people to start doing it? And basically what happens is when the question formulation technique is used, especially with small groups, is all of a sudden there's noise and there's energy in the classroom. And one other thing in terms of facilitating is that, of course, students working on their own, like if you have a small group discussion, this is a small group process in generating questions. Of course, some are going to go a little bit off track. Some might get a little bit unfocused. We've seen teachers just kind of masterfully just remind them, present the question focus again, and say, just keep asking questions right now, no discussion, just keep asking questions. And what it does is it helps the students just kind of remind them to stay with the process. And in the facilitation, it's helpful to have student groups share with each other the results of their process, and that process including sharing examples of their priority questions they changed from open to closed and closed to open, and explain why they chose those 3 questions as priority questions. So the accountability for the students comes in that they know that they're going to be presenting the results of their labor.
This might be an extension of I'm on the side, so I don't worry. This might be an extension of David's question. Nobody in this room, I'm sure, experiences this, but sometimes teachers will ask a question, and if there's no response or they'll put something out and kids aren't going, what's the next step? How can we coach teachers into being able to let go of some of that and to accept the silence as part of the learning process initially?
I was just trying out silence, that's all. It's Connie, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So your question is about the teacher presenting a question to the students and then allowing for some wait time and opportunity for students to do some thinking. Is that correct?
Correct, or just presenting a topic on which students should begin to form some questions around.
Okay, all right. So then let's talk about that because that's a big difference, because usually wait time is discussed in terms of teachers ask a question of students and then try to wait for students to answer. So this changes that dynamic, and it's a shift in practice. It's a shift in practice for teachers. It's a shift in learning experience for students. But there's something really interesting about the idea of presenting a question focus for students to ask questions about, which is that it's legitimate for them to ask a question and to not know the answer. That what's being invited is for you to articulate what you want to know, what you want to understand. And that's very different from responding to a teacher's question where you may be fearful of saying something that is wrong or is not what the teacher is looking for, or will expose that you don't know something. So the question formulation technique changes that dynamic by making it very clear and accompanying it with these rules, the structure for doing it, so that the students are put to work, and that's their only job is to come up with questions. So we do not recommend that you do the question formulation technique with the teacher at the front of the room and inviting questions from the whole class. But we really do recommend you either give students an opportunity to do that work on their questions on their own, or you have them working in small groups. And it pretty much never fails if you give them that opportunity to do it. Now, there are times when you may have designed a question focus that could be very, very complicated, very difficult. I wish I had something to show you here. An example of a teacher who was teaching Albert Camus' The Plague in her 12th grade humanities class. And she put all these quotes up on the PowerPoint, and they were dense, and there was a lot to read, and then she wanted the students to focus on one particular part of it, and she used that her question focus. Well, that bombed, just completely failed. Why? Because what they were doing is that they were trying to absorb, read, understand a lot of information instead of being presented with something that they could quickly look at and then start asking questions about. So we recommend very, very strongly that that students really have a focus that teachers develop a question focus that's very simple. So if you do that, you basically your work is on designing a question focus, and then having them discuss the rules, having them work with the rules, understand what might be difficult about following them, and then basically put them to work. So that is really one of the great benefits that teachers are seeing from the question formulation technique, is that they're not really worried about silence now. They're not worried about wait time, because what's happening is the students are actually getting to work asking their own questions.
Can I just throw out a question here?
Please.
Okay, so so I have my students do, it's kind of like a Socratic seminar, but they basically generate their own questions in competitive teams, and then we throw them out there, and then they discuss it. And there's definitely a perception or a feel from the students. The students all feel like, I mean, these are honor students, right? They're smart kids, and they know the material. They feel at the time that they made the question that it was a really good question, but when it gets thrown out to the room for discussion, there are definitely better and worse questions. Like there's ones that get the whole room kind of buzzing, and then there's other questions that just kind of seem to fall flat. What makes a question buzzworthy?
That's a great question.
Well, what do you all think?
I think it has to have some sort of a personal tie-in to what a student is interested in.
Or evoke an emotion. People are passionate about things they feel strongly enough.
Yeah, so it has to connect with your, not with your mind, but it has to connect with your heart.
Yeah. So even though it doesn't have anything to do with yourself, you can have empathy for people who went through like a war or something along those lines.
Thank you. I'm comfortable with silence.
Okay. No, I mean, because basically what happens is the controlling focus is there's questions about comparison or organization or things like that, all tied into authorial purpose. But the questions that invariably get kids buzzing are the questions about theme, which then I guess ties back to this whole idea of theme is where they connect with the story, right? It's like the human condition or whatever. And so maybe it's just difficult to come up with buzzworthy questions about authorial intent versus the message they're trying to deliver. I'm not sure. I'm thinking about it now.
Okay. So one of the things that we really encourage is the whole process. The process is a process in which you're scaffolding the development of question formulation skills. The students are becoming more sophisticated in their thinking about questions when they are looking at a list of questions that can be anywhere from maybe 7 questions to 20 questions, however many they've generated, and they are trying to assess which ones are their priority questions. Now, part of the key piece here is you as a teacher, you need to decide on your instructions for the direction for the prioritization of the questions. So, for example, if you want students to be doing a research project, you may say, look at your questions and choose the 3 questions that you feel you need to answer first in order to start your research. Or your instructions might be, choose 3 questions that will help you define your research. Or choose 3 questions that you most want to spend time exploring. So that's on research. So if you're designing an experiment, you're going to want to give instructions that might say, choose 3 testable questions. So if they're looking at a math problem that they can't quite figure out, the instructions might be, which questions are going to help you which questions help you with a piece of this problem. So there's different ways to break it up so that you're giving direction with the prioritization of the questions. So one thing that I would say, David, is that it's really important that students go through this process in which they are becoming more sophisticated about their questions by going through that process. Now, it's also very interesting because they may then come up with a question that might be, what, as you describe it, buzzworthy for some students and not for others. Or you as the teacher might not think that really, you asked some other questions that I think, really actually are better, but you seem to be choosing this one as a priority question. And I'm not sure that that's, I don't really think maybe that's the best one that you should choose. And in fact, there's a story in the book about a science teacher who, I'm just looking at this now, where it was actually, it's kind of interesting. It was a science teacher, a math teacher, and a humanities teacher. So kind of you got people around the room. And as we wrote, it's not the opening to a joke, but it's actually about a collaboration. So it's a science teacher, a math teacher, and a humanities teacher enter a classroom. And they used a very, very, very bare bones question focus. This was a unit on which they were going to be getting involved in looking at anti-tobacco legislation at the state, on the state level. And so they just used a very bare bones question focus. Okay, so just think for a second. All right, your students are going to be engaged in a project doing research on anti-tobacco legislation at the state level. So just think for a moment, what would you want to present to them as a question focus that might stimulate some questions from them? So just take a moment, think to yourself, jot it down. Okay. All right. So here's the one that they used. Nothing more complicated than they just used cigarette smoking.
Huh.
That was it. Cigarette smoking. So then the students went through the class, in small groups they worked, and so they asked questions like, Why are cigarettes harmful? What is in a cigarette? Why sell cigarettes if they are deadly? Why do cigarettes have so many chemicals? Who invented cigarettes? Why is that warning label on the cigarette box? What are different ways of quitting? What will it take for stores to stop selling cigarettes? Do you think that this world would be better without cigarettes one day? Why are cigarettes legal? And what do you think that can be done? What do you think can be done to prevent people from smoking? So if you look at those kinds of questions, they ranged from looking at the content of the chemistry of cigarettes, to the problems of addiction, to legal questions. So you look at that wide range there. All right, so now they're choosing a priority question for their research, what they want to spend time researching on. So I just read you a list of questions. The teacher heard the questions, and the science teacher actually had some ideas about what she thought would be the best question for them to pursue. And they, of course, didn't choose what she thought would be the best question to pursue. So which question did they pursue? They want to pursue? They wanted to focus on why is that warning label on the cigarette box. So she thought that they had asked all sorts of other interesting questions, and so why were they just kind of focusing on that? And so what she was surprised, because as they began to do their work, they basically, by focusing on one micro piece of the general problem, they unpacked it all. They looked at what's in that warning, where the evidence came from for that warning, what was required in order to get that warning on the box. So they kind of looked at the range of things from the science to the politics of the problem, and saw it all by just focusing their research on what's in that warning label. So that's an example where part of what you're doing is you're trying to present a simple question focus. You're backed up, you know, in a sense, the rules for producing question really have your back. So that horrible feeling when you present a question and it just falls flat and nobody answers and nobody responds, or you see the same 2 or 3 hands going up as you see all the time. That changes when you use the question formulation technique, because you're basically giving them the opportunity to look at something and start asking questions about it. And the more you basically give them that opportunity, the more they take the ownership of the learning process.
Not a question, but a comment. What a great opportunity for teachers to do some collaborative work in and around a subject and then tie it through English and math or the arts or whatever, but start with a common thread. And what a great opportunity for kids then to be influenced in their learning from a variety of different, you know, a scientific field or maybe a literature field. And so that could pose, teachers working together in a situation like that could pose a great opportunity for collaboration.
Right. And in fact, with just that one example, you could see how in math class you can be looking at the data and the statistics, and in the chemistry class you could be looking at the chemicals. You know, in a history, social studies, government environment, you could be looking at legislation and the politics, the history behind it, you know, there's novels about people who have dealt with cancer, and you know, you could take it right through into literature. So you could look at how student questions could be used as their driving questions for any project they might want to work on in all fields.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and then we got to wrap this up.
I'll let somebody else ask it. Okay, I got it, sorry. Okay, so this questions, let's go back to the kind of social justice aspect of these questions. They really can give kids a lot of power, and the more sophisticated they get at asking questions, they can start asking some really uncomfortable, powerful questions to people in charge. I see this at my school site with the student journalists, who they'll ask somebody from admin or their district some really uncomfortable questions. So how do you help students scaffold difficult and uncomfortable questions? Like, by scaffolding, I mean like the approach or the awareness, or because they get this power, right, from asking questions and asking really good questions. How do they deal with the consequences or the process of asking those questions?
That's something that is an issue in every single field in which we work, and looking at how do people use questions also to advocate for themselves, to participate in decisions that affect them. You don't have control over how people are going to respond to your questions if you are asking questions of authorities. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a right to ask those questions. So sometimes people find is that they ask questions and they don't get very good answers. And so what's required? Well, they actually need to ask different kinds of questions and keep working on those questions. So the scaffolding and the issues of power come together in that sometimes asking questions, getting stonewalled, not getting answers can become a stimulus for looking at what are other ways for us to get this information or to get answers, and what other kinds of questions do we need to be asking. So let me ask you all a question before we finish. So what have you learned from this conversation?
There's a process.
Thank you.
Not just, you have to teach kids the process.
Thank you.
To be successful.
It's more powerful for students to come up with their own questions than to give students, the teacher to give students the questions.
Thank you.
I think also, for me, knowing that as the teacher, we have to design the question focus. So we can't, we don't want to be like, okay, just ask questions. Like, there needs to be scaffolding on our part, so we're not just setting them loose to not know what to do.
Thank you.
I like having the 4 rules that you gave us. When we give the kids that focus, we kind of can guide them through those 4 steps. Because a lot of kids will go off topic and off task, and you can kind of guide them back with those rules.
Thank you.
So Dan, I know you are going to be in our area pretty soon. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you do, like in a full day workshop?
Sure. I want to say 2 resources for you. One of them is our online network, which is free, and you can sign up at rightquestion.org. You can download resources. You can look at examples of how teachers have used it in different fields and see examples. So that's a great place for you to go if you're interested in spending a little more time thinking about this. So that's rightquestion.org. On June 30th, we are going to be in LA. And we're offering a 1-day seminar, which starts off with a deep immersion in an experience in the question formulation technique that we facilitate. You see how we facilitate it, how it's structured. You go through the process as participants without worrying about how are you going to teach this or use this in the classroom. You first get an experience in the process itself. And then we unpack with you the question formulation technique, look at the different aspects at it, try to kind of identify the thinking abilities behind it as I discussed with you today, going deeper into that. And then we begin to look more closely at specific examples across different subject areas of how it's used. One of the big pieces of a 1-day seminar is actually spending time on doing question-focused design. Because the question-focused design is really the key element for you to feel comfortable in saying, okay, I've got a question focus that I think is going to work. Now, you may find out that it works with one class and didn't work with another. You'll find out it gets different kind of responses. But the opportunities to do some question-focused design, get feedback from peers and colleagues who are in the seminar, and then some practice facilitation of that. And then applications for how you will use this in your classroom. And so you basically walk out of that seminar fully ready to implement.
Cool. Thank you.
It's also
Thank
a
you
great
so
experience.
much for joining us today, and I think we all got a lot out of it.
Well, my pleasure, and I hope to see you on the network.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in LA.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks again.